Before you begin sewing, you need to set up your sewing machine. I use white thread in my top and in my bobbin. I use white because most t-shirts are white, or at least you're going to have at least 1 or 2 white shirts in there. The only time I would use black thread is if all the t-shirts in the quilt were actually black. Otherwise, plan to just use white. After you have threaded your machine with white on the top and the bottom, the next thing is to decide what type of needle to use. We like to use Schmetz micro sharp needles. We like them because they're very fine and very sharp and will put less holes into the quilt. Many people like to use ballpoint needles, but I've found that they actually just put bigger holes in your t-shirt material than a micro sharp. So I would suggest using micro sharp needles. Next, we're quilting, so we need to use a 1/4 inch foot because our seam allowance is 1/4 inch. If you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, you need to either get a 1/4 inch foot or mark your plate where your 1/4 inch is. I have found that using a built-in walking foot is the best way to sew t-shirt material. On this machine right here, this is our built-in walking foot. So what happens is the feed dogs down here, and this is a secondary feed dogs, they will feed the material together evenly. If you don't have built-in dual walking foot, I would suggest then you either get a walking foot that you can attach to your machine. Some of the newer machines you can use without a built-in dual walking foot because the technology is better. But basically, we want to try to have both layers of your material feed into your machine at the same time. Now that we have our sewing machine set up, let's practice sewing some t-shirt blocks. If you've not already cut some filler blocks or some 4x4s for practice, take some time to do so now. It's important to practice sewing because you've got to learn how t-shirt material sews. It does sew different than cotton material. Once you have 4 4x4s cut, look at them very carefully. All t-shirt material has what's called a grain, and it runs up and down. T-shirt material also has an inside and an outside. So when you're sewing blocks together, you want to look carefully and make sure that all your grain is running up and down and all the t-shirt blocks are right side up. Once you do that, then you can practice starting to sew. You have 2 options when you're sewing 4 blocks together like this. You could sew these 2 seams, and then combine it like that. But since this is t-shirt material, you need to really think a little bit better about that. Your grain is running up and down, and you want to sew actually this seam first on each of them because the material will lay differently after a seam is sewn. So let me show you what the difference is. So I will sew these 2 seams together, and then I'll sew these 2 seams together, and we'll look at the back and see the difference. Notice that I'm gathering my threads. This is going to be really important. I just pull back on the threads as I begin. All right, so there's my 2 seams with the grain running vertically. Now I'm going to have the grain running vertically, but do the opposite side. Let's look at the difference. Watch what happens when the grain is parallel to each other. It folds perfectly flat. It looks like I've ironed that seam, and actually I just pushed it open. But this one does not lay flat at all. It bunches up. But you don't ever need to iron anything on a t-shirt material. But the trick is to use this to our advantage. So let's put this away and grab 2 more blocks. And sew 2 more blocks vertically like this. So I want to make sure my blocks are right side up and the grain is running the same direction. I don't want it to turn sideways. I want all the grain running up and down. So let's put these 2 blocks together. All right, so there it is standing up again. So the really cool thing is we take these 2 blocks to put together, and if you fold one seam one way, one seam the other way, there's a little step there, and this step is perfect for lining your blocks together. Push it around until you feel it lying perfectly flat. Once it's flat, you'll make a perfect 4 corners every time you sew. So I'm going to start here at the top. Sew a little way in, and then I use my table on my sewing machine to help flatten out the material. I'm using my fingers and I'm feeling that and making sure that it lies flat. I want to make sure everything kind of hooks in like that with each other. And again, I double check it as I get closer. Make sure it stays flat. Use my fingers as pens. Okay, so this is the back of this. My vertical seam will open flat, like that. And then you can look on the front and you'll have had a perfect 4 corners. These seams match up perfectly. And so that's what's really cool about using that locking mechanism. So you can have perfect corners every time. So you just have to think about, I want to sew down and then across. That's a perfect 4 corner. I would suggest you make 10 to 15 of these blocks to make yourself a perfect sewer. Once you get 2 and 3 and 4 in a row perfect, you're ready to move on. Ripping out seams in t-shirt materials is a pain in the butt. Unfortunately, you probably will run into circumstances where you're going to need to do it. Take your seam ripper and put the point in every 3rd to 4th stitch and rip. When you've gone a few inches, you'll turn your work over and you'll simply pull out the stitches. You need to be very careful that you don't put holes into your seams because the holes will be there and they won't be hidden. Be careful and very methodical when you're ripping stitches out of your t-shirt material. Here is the basic way to sew 2 pieces of t-shirt material together. First, I line up the 2 corners and I only go down about 2 inches. That's all I line up. I let the rest just dangle. Next, I move it over to my sewing machine and I put my presser foot down. Now I want to make sure that when my needle goes into the fabric, it's in the fabric. It should not be behind the fabric. It should not be way forward. It needs to go just a little bit into the fabric. And at the same time, I'm going to hold back on my 2 threads here and I'm going to pull back while the machine starts. After you've gone about 1 inch, you can let go of the strings and then you can line up the rest of your material. So I go down to the bottom and I line it up. And I start sewing. Now if you look, you'll see that these 2 pieces of material don't quite line up. One is rolled under. And I know a lot of people freak out when they see that, but it's really not an issue. Basically, you line up the bottom of your material and then you just use your fingers to push over the rolled up material as you sew. Stop when you hit your finger, reline up your material. Keep relining up your material. Use your fingers to hold it flat. And then you're done. That is your basic seam for making a t-shirt quilt. In a t-shirt quilt like these, not all the seams will come out even. You'll need to use a half seam construction to build these blocks together. Right now, let's practice a half seam. Knowing how to do a half seam is very important in making a t-shirt quilt. So we have a setup here. We have 5 blocks. The 2 green blocks are 8 by 4s. The 2 blue blocks are 4 by 8 inches. So the grain on all my pieces is running vertical, including the center piece. So to sew this configuration together, I am going to start by sewing from here to here and stopping. So I've got the blocks lined up. I sew halfway down the seam and stop. When I open the seam up, you'll see that now I have a full width that I can sew. So I line these two blocks up and sew. I open this back up, and now I have another area that I'm ready to sew. Open this back up. And I have another area that I can sew. Now, I can go back in and finish the seam that I began because now the seam is long enough. So remember, when we first sewed these two together, all we had was this pink block. But now that we've sewed all these other blocks on, we can go finish the last seam. Most of the time when you're making a t-shirt quilt, your last seam will be the completion of a half seam. So there's our completed block. Because of the half seam construction, you can have a much more complex block than you could if you could only sew straight seams. One of the situations you're going to run into is that the machine is not advancing the fabric. Mainly this happens when you forget to pull your two threads. Sometimes you're going to forget to pull the thread and it's not going to advance, and you're going to end up with all these little stitches at the beginning of your seam. What I suggest is you turn your block around and start from the other end of the block. Reline up your ends. This time, remember to hold your threads. Sew your seam, and when you get to the other end, you will either run over the stitches with your new seam, or the stitches will be on the inside. Most of the time they'll never show on the outside of the quilt because they're going to be within the seam allowance. So your seam will be just fine. You're going to run into instances when your material is sucked down into the throat plate of your sewing machine. This mainly happens when you have not held your strings back when you started your stitch. To get yourself out of this situation, begin by removing the needle and using your crank arm to pull this out. You'll notice that you've created a knot at the beginning of your seam. Simply turn your seam over and start from the other end. This time, of course, remember to hold your strings back. Also remember to have the needle go right into the beginning of your fabric, not before your fabric. When you complete your seam, you'll notice that the knot you created when you first started the seam is either in the seam allowance or on top of the seam that you just made. Either way, your seam is going to be fine. Another situation you may run into is when the material of your two blocks is a little bit off. One may be a little bit longer than the other. To solve this problem, just gently pull the top material so it lines up with the bottom material and finish your seam. The trick to not getting into this situation is to make sure that you have your blocks laying smoothly together and you're not pulling one against the other. So I'm going to line up my two ends and just pull a little bit. and your seam will line up. Sometimes one of the fabrics will roll in on itself as you're sewing. This is okay. It's because you're sewing on the vertical and the seam likes to just roll under. So when you're sewing, basically you're just going to use your fingers to hold down your seam. You line up everything just right. Use your fingers to pinch and make sure that it all lines up. And then you can relax and you know that your presser foot's going to push the material right back down into the right space. It's rolling. It's lined up. I just let my presser foot push that seam down. Then when you're done, the seam will just automatically flatten out. This is what happens when you have vertical seams. This will not happen on a horizontal seam. Keep practicing sewing until you feel confident. When you're ready, let's go sew your quilt top together.